welcome to the Apollo Road podcast. I'm here with Kyle Kmetz from with Wander Coffee up here in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Alex.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It has.
Definitely been a couple of years, I think, since I've touched base with you, and lots happened.
At least since you've been into the shop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and it's cool to see the old Probot still kicking, and you've got made quite the change in leaps and bounds, I think, over the last couple of years. And we were just talking about your new packaging for the coffee bags, and that looks great.
Thank you.
Always been a fan of the coffee, of course. My dad usually orders a couple pounds at a time.
Oh, no, your dad, he's a huge supporter, man. I think he orders a 5-pound bag every month.
Yeah, he goes for it.
Yeah. You guys definitely like it strong and dark.
Yep. Yeah, he runs the mocha pot every morning.
Oh, cool.
That's kind of his routine. And that's actually what got me into coffee. Back in the day, we went on a camping trip, I think, and I never drank coffee, and he pulled out the mocha pot, and when you're camping, it's just, everything's so much more romantic, and you always get, you have fond memories of it.
Everything tastes better. And
yeah. But since then, I think I was like 20 at the time. Then I started getting into buying whole beans and grinding it. And that was like the next killer step of like, oh, this is so much different than going to the grocery store and buying pre-ground.
Absolutely. I think shortly after that, that's when we came into contact.
Yeah, I think so. I think I was
jumped in on one of our very first cuppings that we held.
Oh, that's right.
I think you were in the very first one we did.
That's right. My buddy James and I think we had just looked for like local roasters, and your Wander came right up. Man, that was a few years ago.
It was. We haven't done too many public cuppings since then, but I think we're gonna, of course, once we're allowed to be within 6 feet of each other,
right.
I think we'll start holding a few more public cuppings, maybe one a month or something like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
So how'd you get into coffee? I know, I guess give us the backstory.
Yeah. I'm a Wyoming boy originally, just born and raised up over the border in Laramie, Wyoming. And my experience, probably similar to you, I worked a ton of different jobs. And then through college, I started working at a coffee shop up in Laramie called Coal Creek Coffee. And John Guerin, the owner there, they roast all their own coffee. So then kind of work in the shop first couple years, and then they had a roasting position open up there. And so I apprenticed with their main roast master, and that's kind of where I got my first initial intro to roasting.
Awesome. What kind of volumes were they doing? Actually,
about similar size roaster to this. And he's got 2 shops in Laramie, 2 Coal Creeks in Laramie, and then he does a bit of wholesale around the state. But roughly the same size batches. I'm not entirely sure how many batches a week they're doing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, like, when people get into roasting coffee, I mean, that's got to be kind of nerve-wracking because when you've got a batch of coffee, it's typically like 25 pounds. Is that what this capacity is? So if
I run it closer to
17
pounds is what I run. I like to kind of have a more nimble batch size, so I can, it really, whether I want to, it's just a lot more receptive to your heat application.
Okay.
But I totally understand that, when you have that much product in there, it's definitely nerve-wracking. That's why the roasting positions are tough to get. It's a lot. You have to really be on your game. And then, so after I graduated, my wife moved out to Indianapolis, took a job out there. And so I started, super fortunate to work for this company called Hubbard & Cravens out in Indianapolis. And that, talk about pressure. That was, their roaster, on the high limit, it could do 4 whole bags. So roughly, our batches were 500 to 700 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
So that's where it's like, okay, you're up at another level when you screw up a batch.
Yeah, you definitely.
On that.
Yeah. Had that ever happened?
I never screwed a batch up on that big roaster. They also had a small roaster that would do 100-pound batches.
Okay.
And I didn't damage any coffee, but I ended up starting a fire in the and the cyclone one day, and that was a little nerve wracking.
Yeah.
But the guy that trained me, and I still keep in contact with him, Nick Hubbard. He a batch went sideways on him one day when I was throwing bags for him, and yeah, it was a heck of a lot of product.
Yeah, that talk about being forged in the fires of coffee roasting.
Mm-hmm.
Did you always like coffee, or was that always something you wanted to do, or did you just kind of fall into it?
Kind of just fell into it. The owner of Coal Creek, his son was the one that was roasting at the time and that trained me how to roast. And him and I were good buddies. So basically, I took a year off of college and was kind of figuring things out. And when I came back and jumped back into classes, he was like, "Hey man, come work at Coal Creek." Never really liked coffee before then, but you know, when you're just working in a shop every day, I just started taste testing everything and
Just developed
found a taste for it. Of course, you know, I started out black coffee with quite a bit of cream in it. Mm-hmm. Was my thing. And then, you know, eventually you start taking little shots of espresso and, you know, go from there.
So what are we sipping on right here?
This is Mexico Montalban.
Oh, nice.
I think you might be familiar with that coffee. Mm-hmm. It's the third year in a row that we've worked with them.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think, my buddy is into the Chiapas.
Sure. Yeah.
He likes that a lot. And then for a period of time, we were kind of ordering through trade coffee, and we just kind of picked a few throughout the country. And I think we did like a little Mexico coffee sample pack.
Yeah, in Mexico, it can often be overlooked, but
yeah,
this has been at least for our customers a crowd favorite, which is why we keep bringing it back in year to year.
Cool. Yeah, it's really good. For people that don't quite understand the coffee industry, maybe you could just break down
Sure.
Kind of the difference of like quote unquote coffee, which is the broad, most people are just, it's coffee, it's black, it's put cream in it, right? But once you start realizing that each country has this very specific type of roast and then, you know, single origin versus blends, I guess just give people that might not have no clue, just the basic.
I can do a cut and dry version here. And that's what's kept me interested for over a decade now. It's literally a rabbit hole. Once you start, you know, you have these questions about coffee, what it is, where it's grown. And as you start to follow up on these questions, more and more questions arise, you know? And so it's honestly, even still to this day, I'm finding new things out, and it's always keeping me interested. But so really, coffee, it grows inside of a cherry on a tree. Basically, it kind of hovers the equator. That's your main growing zone. But it's anywhere from the Tropic of Cancer to Capricorn, and that belt is where coffee grows. So really, people ask me like, "Oh, do you buy any of your coffee? You know, where does coffee grow in the United States?" I'm like, "Well, pretty much just Hawaii. You know, that's about the only place. I think California, they got some coffee. They actually, because one of the big issues when you're growing coffee is that once you plant your tree, it's anywhere from 4 to 7 years later when you get your first harvest out of it. So it's a heck of a long time. But I was reading that, I don't know if it was in a greenhouse, but it must have had to have been in a greenhouse, but they grew the first and harvested the first coffee out of California. And it was, you know, I think they were selling bags of it for like $100 a bag. You know,
it's a matter of time, right? Before they figure that out. Wow. That's pretty expensive though. Cause so that period of 4 to 7 years, I think that's similar to like grapevines for wine too.
Sure. Yeah.
That's gotta be as a financial, that's like a financial hurdle if you want to start growing coffee.
Oh,
so
yeah. Yeah.
I guess that's why all of the countries that have already been roasting for decades and decades, they just have it locked in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There is a lack of just genetic diversity within the species of coffee, which, you know, there's some people that are a lot smarter than me trying to tackle that issue. But that's definitely a huge risk factor for the farmers. You know, if they spend all these years growing these trees and then any number of diseases or, you know, insects, pests can just completely tarnish their crop, and they have to, you know, basically slash and burn and start again. You know, so that genetic diversity and what some, especially different coffee organizations are working towards creating a little bit more robustness, and that is definitely beneficial.
Interesting. I think I had heard about that, and I didn't quite understand it. The genetic diversity in the, I guess, the species of plant. Essentially, like what, they all can be traced back to Ethiopia. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Ethiopia, it's one of those origins that, coffee consumers and coffee professionals alike go crazy for. There's a ton of just heirloom varietals hanging around Ethiopia, and, those coffees can always be, very floral, tea-like, fruity, just a whole wide spectrum. And so those are often very coveted. People tend to love those Ethiopian coffees for that reason. But yeah, you're totally right. It started there. And I think that, there's some folklore that, the first people that probably roasted coffee was just sheer accident. Those coffee, somehow out of that cherry, those coffee seeds made it out and kind of landed next to a fire, and then ended up like roasting that way.
And then, how did they make the leap from extracting it and realize there's caffeine in there? And
totally.
That's always got to be the cool part of the folklore.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Huh.
So yeah, I mean, if you really start to follow the supply chain starting from the grower, it's just endlessly fascinating. And especially, when I'm training different baristas at coffee shops, I try and bring that up, the importance of, those baristas are the very end of the supply chain before it hits a customer, and so literally that coffee's probably been touched by about 100 different hands before it makes it to your cup. You've got your growers, everyone that's working on the farm level, and then you'll have your pickers coming through, picking that. And then if it's not processed on the farm, it's sent to a processing facility. You have a couple other dozen people touching it. Then you got your import, your export, import, that's going into different warehouses and then onto trucks. And then finally to me, and then from me, out to different coffee shops. And
that's a good point, actually, that the supply chain is, it's so complicated. And like you said, hundreds of hands handle the coffee. I mean, just for people that, if you can't quite grasp how complex it is, think about wine. All of the processing takes place typically, like the vineyard grows the grapes and they press them and they ferment them and then they bottle it. And then you just go buy the bottle, open it, drink it, and you're good to go. But with coffee, it's totally different. I mean, you're buying green coffee, right? And so it's still that's almost where it begins, the second half of the journey. And
totally.
And yet the whole thing took so much work just to get you those beans.
Yeah. I'm a pretty big believer that a lot of the intrinsic flavors and the goodness that comes from a particular coffee, a lot of that is done on the farm level and at the processing level. So, they'll send their coffee cherries to a processing plant to get depulped and, washed, or if it's a naturally processed coffee. And so for me, my main thing, for at least in my mind, is to do the least amount of damage to that coffee. Basically try and maintain those flavors that are already in there. 'Cause those flavors are there. I'm just adding heat to it in a specific way, in order to bring out all those qualities. As a roaster, I don't think that I'm necessarily adding any sort of flavors to it.
Interesting.
That's kind of my philosophy, and that's what I push onto the baristas, just try and maximize the flavors that are already in there, and pay your respects through your quality of work to those people on the back end that, are doing that hard labor. Oftentimes, when you're growing coffee, especially the specialty grade coffees that we're bringing in, generally as a rule of thumb, higher elevation means higher quality. Your coffee plant itself, it takes a lot more work for it to grow that coffee cherry. So it's often a much denser, much more complex coffee at higher elevations. And so what comes with that is you can't drive your mechanical machines up there to harvest. So a lot of times when people are like, oh, a specialty coffee, those higher quality coffees, it's so much more expensive. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, people have coffee sacks on their back and they're hiking these mountainscapes trying to harvest these coffees. And so a lot of what you're paying for is that labor on the back end, at the very beginning of the supply chain.
Yeah, that's just kind of letting that sink in because, I went down the rabbit hole of coffee early on in my coffee drinking career, which I mentioned it started at 20. But it is fascinating, and seems like every year there's always more and more that you learn, and there's more about the whole process that you learn, and just the density of labor that goes into coffee is sometimes, at least from my perspective, it seems like there's a mismatch in public awareness, appreciation. Even for me, I mean, we buy your coffee and we love it, and yet I'm guilty of, I'll read the label, cool, it came from here, I like the way it tastes, and I kind of go on with my day, but I haven't really done sort of a deep dive into all these farms and seeing like where the money comes from and where it goes, and maybe at which points of the supply chain maybe there should be more attention brought to.
Yeah, and I think, there's some, you've got your big players like Peet's and Starbucks, and they're paying over the C price, which is what the coffee price is traded on the stock market. And so that's what they say. They're paying above, and it might be a penny above what the C price is. But there's some bigger companies that are in the specialty realm that have definitely paved the road, like your Intelligentsia, Counterculture, Stumptown, and those guys, I just have the utmost respect for them because they were really breaking the ground on, let's really put a spotlight on these individual farmers, or if it's a cooperatively ran group, highlight this co-op and, try and buy these coffees year to year, paying them a good price. And a lot of those guys, because they were buying that coffee directly, they could dictate what price they were paying. But even for me, we have a couple main importers, and most of our coffees, they're essentially relationship coffees. We work with one collective called San Sebastian. It's in the Huila region of Colombia, and it's literally the bedrock of our whole coffee program. All of our blends have some portion of that San Sebastian in it, and that's a collective of 100 farmers that, year to year, it's the most consistent coffee, and we're paying them a good price for it. And the nice thing about the importers that they'll send transparency reports and show you, this is where all your money is going. Like the farmer is making this much money per pound from what you're paying, which is a good thing, because I think some roasters are like, yeah, we're paying $2 over fair trade price. We're paying a good price. It's like, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're paying a good price, but there's just so many hands between the farmer and the roaster that you don't know how much is truly getting back to the farmer. So you could be paying a lot of money for your coffee, and the farmer's still getting none of it.
Wow.
Very minimal of it.
I hadn't really considered that. So the transparency reports seem to be key, because I think there has been a lot more awareness in the last couple of years about specialty coffee and like the farming, and I think most people are now aware of it because Starbucks, they've done a good job of kind of putting some awareness on it.
Yeah, Starbucks deserves some credit because they definitely opened up the door for all of the rest of us, essentially. Like your Stumptowns and your Intelligentsias have Starbucks to thank for opening the market to it.
Yeah. So is it fair to say now that as a consumer, like maybe for people at home that want to be more, I guess, accountable, or at least know, like, yeah, it's not bad to support a bunch of different coffee suppliers, regardless of whether they have this sort of fully transparent supply chain. Like, it's not the end of the world if you buy something at the grocery store from whoever, but it's, I guess, for people that are interested in it, what would you recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk too about fair trade, and some people are all about fair trade, and some people are like, no, I think there's some things that are wrong with that. But in my mind, I think when in doubt, if you don't know what to get, if it has a certified fair trade label on it, that's a good start. And fair trade, to me, it's a really great baseline price to be paying a farmer. but it's not the best price that you could be paying.
Right.
So that's one way, if it has a fair trade label on it, that's, it's better than most. And then also a lot of roasters have that information on their site. You can look up, what their relationship is with their importers and a lot of times they'll have some companies will even, they'll put up what they're paying for their green coffee, and stuff like that. And then the other way is, if you're curious, I get calls like this every now and then, and I'm more than happy to chat with a customer if they want to, dig a little deeper into where their coffee comes from. So I think if you get a hold of a roaster and, they're not too interested in talking about that or talking to you, it's like, well, go find someone else.
You can kind of feel them out.
There's dozens and dozens of really high quality roasters, specialty roasters that are doing a great job and, paying great prices for their coffees, and they know where that money's going.
Yeah. That's what I've always liked about you and your business, is that you were right there on the other side of the phone. And, when we signed up for that initial cupping, it's like, yeah, you called me right back, and, we talked to you and we see the roaster, and, you were super open and friendly, and it's just, that's the kind of like customer service, and, it's like you're a real person. I think people really, really value that this day and age.
That goes back to the dozens and dozens of roasters that are doing a good job. That it hit me early on that, coffee roasters, especially ones that are buying specialty grade coffees, and we're all buying pretty similar coffees from, the same countries, and we're roasting them in a relatively similar way, and we're pricing them in about the same spots. So there's, the one big differentiator is customer service in my mind, and that's the one piece, doing wholesale that, of course, the coffee shops and restaurants and everyone else that we work with, when I'm doing deliveries, I'll chat their ears off, because a lot of times I'm standing here by myself all day in my own thoughts. So I miss that component of it, chatting with customers. And I think that's something looking towards the future, that, whether it be an expanded roastery with maybe a tasting side of things, having a small bar where we can chit chat with customers. And that's the one piece, we do what we can for being a wholesale roaster to give people the best service possible.
Yeah. Cool. Another thought that crossed my mind: what about the roasters that buy their own farm, or they have like a family farm? That I've seen that more often now.
I've seen it.
Pretty rare still, I think.
It is relatively rare, and import export, it can be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
I'm not super versed in it by any means, but I know enough to know that it's extremely difficult, and I know of roasters that are banging their heads against the wall as they're literally setting up export, and then they're setting up import into their roastery, and, they'll be banging their heads against the wall because all of their whole container of coffee, could be $100,000, $200,000 worth of coffee, is sitting on a container at a super high temperature, high elevation, stuck at port for a couple weeks, and so literally that coffee's just gaining moisture and, it can ferment, and there's a whole slew of reasons, a whole slew of things that can go wrong. And, so yeah, it's definitely, it's not very common because of that.
I guess the volume too, it might be a weird, like, I'm not really sure how the import export business works either, but like you said, if there's a huge volume of coffee, it's almost easier to ship a huge volume instead of smaller batches from the farm.
Yeah, most of the time you're filling a container.
Right.
That's the only way to make it work financially. A lot of times, and we've been doing a little bit of this with some roasters and some roasters that are really close to us. We've been essentially, they're going in a couple of them on containers together. So basically they have a little bit more, they don't have to fill out 300 bags on a container. They can partition off, we'll take these 100 bags, you take these 100 bags. And so I've been jumping in on a little bit of that.
Oh, cool.
Help, getting in on some containers and try and, fill those out.
And just a quick note for people that don't know, when you buy coffee, like I said, it's green, and the shelf life when it's green is how many months typically?
It's roughly 6 to 9 months.
Okay.
About 9 months, it starts to get called what we call past crop flavors.
Okay.
So it's still those coffees. I mean, they're especially a lot of our high grade coffees. They're still exceptional coffees 9 months later. They just don't quite have that pop or that punch that they used to.
So there is a little leeway, I guess, in the import export. But it could still, I can imagine it could get pretty hairy.
Yeah.
Especially in times like these where like the ports are backed up, and I'm not sure if that has affected your business at all.
We're seeing a little bit of that for sure. Like we've had one coffee that was supposed to get in October, and then it ended up getting in mid to late December. It finally got into the States and landed and got in a warehouse. And so that there's some definitely, when you're buying coffees, a lot of roasters, a lot of the smaller roasters buy what's called spot coffees. And a spot coffee is essentially, it's in the United States, it's in a warehouse, and it's available for someone. It doesn't have anyone else's name on it. And so those ones, that's easy. You just get those on a truck. And there's, even with trucking right now, they're having some issues as well. I've had pretty good luck, but you could be stalled out a week or two in some cases, especially in this region, where we get lots of snow. Those things could be stalled out, and your customers want coffee regardless. Right. So you got to figure it out.
Yeah. That's, I think we had touched on this before we started recording, that it's such a complex industry and there's so many different angles, and, we could spend hours and hours going over like all these nuanced aspects of it. But, let's take it back to, when you started Wander.
Sure.
Going from kind of, you said you apprenticed as a roaster and then you got in with a bigger player and you really cut your teeth. Then opening up your own shop, that's a big step.
So I'll just continue that on. So I was working for Hubbard & Cravens, and phenomenal company. I to this day I feel really fortunate that they even hired me at the time. I still keep in contact with a lot of those guys, and I just learned a heck of a lot from them. They the owners, Rick Hubbard and Jerry Cravens, super good guys. They know almost as much as you can know about the coffee industry. A good 30 years of experience between both of them. So that was a huge resource for me when I was working there, because I was a super curious guy, so I had questions about everything. And so they were more than happy to sit down with me after work and chit chat. And their son, Nick Hubbard, I still keep in contact with him, and we chat coffee. And it was really working through those guys. They were kind of the catalyst that, showed me that rabbit hole. And we're like, and, for them, Rick, at the time that I was working there, he was traveling, had to have been more than 6 months out of the year to every country imaginable, Sumatra, any country that was growing coffee, from Central to South America, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sumatra. He was on the farm levels, just trying to find those, really high quality coffees that a lot of times, your importers, they have very specific specs on what coffees they need. So you might have, 4 or 5 cups on a table if you're in Costa Rica, for instance, and you have, 150 coffees to cup. There might be like 5 or 6 for this importer in the US that it matches their qualifications. So, that's their coffee. And what I've heard from those guys is that you really have to get there and cup all those coffees in between the other coffees to find those hidden gems,
So there's definitely like some skill, and there's a little bit of luck almost in like finding something before somebody else gets to it.
You certainly have to have a pretty darn good palate, especially when you're cupping 150 different coffees, and Nick's told me that he's like, we'll start at 7 or 8, and by lunchtime, everything just starts tasting the same, like your palate just gets out, I guess you call it palate fatigue almost.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. That's actually a really key point. I'm glad you brought that up, because palate and taste buds, and that's one area where everybody's so different, and that can influence your taste in everything. I mean, coffee, wine, food.
Absolutely.
And I wonder like what you think your palate and like your sense of smell is as a roaster, and maybe can you develop that? Because I think I've noticed that when I started off, I tasted like a Blue Bottle coffee, and this was like back in like 2011, kind of before they blew up. And it was the first time when I was like, man, I can actually taste something resembling chocolate in this coffee. And that just blew my mind. And then ever since then, I don't think I have the best palate, but I think I've just
I'm willing to bet yours is better than most.
And so that's cool. It's maybe there is some sort of trainable aspect to it.
Oh yeah, no, 100% it's trainable. Through working in Indianapolis, we just cupped, and cupping coffees is basically what roasters, importers, even coffee shops, it's a very standardized way to qualitatively analyze coffees. And so it's basically just cupping all the time, tasting coffees all the time. And even more than that, like when I was working in coffee shops, every single batch that I would brew on a brewer, I would just have my little espresso cup and I would just take if I was brewing 10 pots of coffee throughout the day, I was tasting every single one, and mostly looking for strength, is it too strong versus too weak? But tasting is certainly a skill that you can hone, and mine's very attuned these days to roasting defects. So that's basically, I'm just, when I'm buying coffees, for instance, I'm looking at, I'm looking at different flavors and if that kind of tickles my fancy that way. But a lot of times my biggest qualification is if I try coffee and I just continually go back to it and want to drink a second cup, third cup, I'm like, okay, that's a good coffee to me, Where when I'm doing production roasting and then I'm cupping those coffees, that can be, that for me, that's more, was something going on with the roast? Is my airflow not quite right? Was my time or temperature slightly different than the week before? Or maybe like, oh, wow, I liked this a lot more than last week. What was different about it? How can I figure that out? And so, these days I'm not really necessarily drinking coffee for pleasure. And especially when it's kind of sad, but when I'm drinking other people's coffee, I'm not really, drinking it for the pleasure of it. I'm just thinking like, what is wrong with this coffee? You're like, oh yeah, I think this is an all around a very solid coffee.
Yeah.
It was roasted well, it was brewed well.
That's actually a good point too, is you can roast a perfect coffee, but then if you don't have a good grinder or a good brew method or a good espresso machine, it won't make a difference.
Oh, that's my biggest, if people are asking how to make their coffee taste better, number one is clean your stuff, clean your equipment, clean everything, make sure it's spotless. And you would not believe, even especially when you're pulling espresso with a portafilter, it can be 2 or 3 days of not cleaning it. It's just coated in black shit, and so that's my number one piece of advice. Make sure everything's spotless clean. And then the second one goes to what you're saying, good sharp burrs on a good grinder. That's about the most important thing. And then third is coffee quality. Right. Make sure you have good coffee. But other than that, that's the big three. You can get some phenomenal cups just following those rules.
Cool. So it sounds like you refined all of these skills of both the production and then the tasting and the preparation.
Yeah. So going back to the journey. So with Rick Hubbard traveling the world all the time, that just totally opened my eyes to like, whoa, this is way bigger than I thought. It's not just like, I think to the detriment of the coffee industry, Folgers and a lot of those old school guys that were just taking coffees from all over the place and blending them and roasting them dark, to kind of mask those flavors. Definitely, it didn't allow people to really see, just how kind of going back to what you were saying, how diverse in flavor coffees are, even within a specific country. I'm always amazed trying different coffees from like Colombia, for instance, and you've got like a San Sebastian that's just really full-bodied. You've got your chocolate notes and good sweetness, and then you'll go over to a completely different region and you're getting more fruit notes and maybe stone fruits, and just the diversity in flavors just within a single country is absolutely incredible. And so it's kind of all those things combined where I was like, wow, this is endlessly fascinating to me. And then, at that point I was, roughly 7-8 years in, maybe a little shorter than that. And I was like, okay, I've done a lot of different types of jobs within this specific industry. And, I have my own ideas and my own kinds of things that I'd like to do. So, I'm a young guy. If I don't take the plunge now, at least try it, then I may never will.
Yeah, I like that. That's the entrepreneurial spirit, where you kind of get that itch and you're like, oh, maybe you're right. Maybe I should make a go at this. Mm-hmm. How'd you end up in Colorado, or did you go to Wyoming first?
Well, we ended up getting this place, and as we were looking for places to live down in Colorado, we were staying with our my wife's folks up in Wyoming for a few months.
Oh,
but
cool.
Yeah, I had it was a month or two lead time on the roaster, so I purchased the roaster right when I quit in Indianapolis, and then it was kind of a rush because we didn't have a space to put it. So, it finished up on production, them building it, and they're like, hey, where do you want us to ship this thing? Yeah. So then it was like, okay, we got to find a place to put this.
Yeah.
And then that just, that was an invaluable experience getting everything set up. My wife and I, we're both, my wife's the co-owner, extremely talented at everything she does, but her and I both are super duper stubborn. We just have this tendency to do everything ourselves. We've hired some stuff out here and there, and it never comes back to our quality standards, or, it should be a week lead time, and it takes 3 months. So just between all that, we're like, we could do most of this ourselves, and so from building the site and getting all of our equipment installed, and, but it was a super valuable experience because I hit about every roadblock imaginable. Trying to, even just getting the equipment going, I had to upgrade gas lines and.
Yeah, I guess, and for people that don't realize, when I first met you and you gave me a tour of the place, I was like, holy shit, is that an afterburner? I had seen it online somewhere, like some coffee shop tour, and you were like, I guess like one of the first shops in town that had an afterburner.
I think so. Yeah, I mean,
I was super
for
impressed.
Good reason. It's for good reason. They can be tricky to set up, and it's just cost prohibitive. They're not cheap. But for us, and you've seen our bags. All of our bags are 100% compostable, and the afterburner, that was another component of basically one of our main pillars of sustainability. And not throwing endless amounts of packaging into the waste. That plastic packaging. And like for instance, this year, or I should say in 2020, we did roughly 5,000 bags, and that's between 16 ounce and 8 ounce sizes, but a total of roughly 5,000 bags. So if you just stop to think about that, like that's like it's a full stack of plastic that you could potentially be shooting back out there. So that's super duper important to us. And then the afterburner was just another component where we just didn't feel very good about, there's a lot of volatile organic compounds when you're roasting that,
right,
play into those greenhouse gases and everything that contributes to that. And so it was really important for us to have an afterburner. There's some roasting companies now that have some built-in burning units and stuff like that, but having an external, at least on our exhaust system, having an external afterburner that's not built in, it kills 100% of all the VOCs. And so our big byproduct is H2O and CO2.
Right. And even I saw that like some states or municipalities, even by law, are starting to require that coffee shops, if they roast a certain volume, they have to have an afterburner.
Yeah, California is the prime example of that.
Right.
I don't even think it matters what size of roaster, just any roaster at all, you have to have some sort of afterburner unit. And then you have to be able to piggyback off of your thermocouple and data log all your temperatures. So the state will, come in and be like, okay, you've got an afterburner, but have you been using it?
Interesting. Oh, I see.
So you have to prove, show them your temperatures that you were running it at.
That's interesting.
And I think Colorado I think we're going to get there. We have some similarities with California in terms of our, we love our clean air and our clean water, and I'm all about that too. So I think there'll be a move to that.
Yeah. And that's an interesting concept that I had never even considered until you learned about it. That, anytime you burn something, you're putting something into the atmosphere. So it's kind of like those oil, like mining operations where you see the gas flares, on the top of the smokestack, and you just see that flame. Well, they put that flare up there so that it burns off like the really bad VOCs, and it like burns off the methane and stuff. So it's still, converting to CO2, but it's not as bad. And, I had never even considered like, oh shoot, yeah, coffee, roasting also is burning something. So that's a valid component of the supply chain in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that moving more towards renewable resources and electric is what needs to be done. And but for me and every other coffee roaster, that's the big dilemma, because there aren't a heck of a lot of decent electric roasters. We rely on natural gas and propane. The heat application that you get running natural gas just can't be duplicated with electric at this point. But I mean, I do have my eye on a lot of different technologies. Like I actually think it's out of CU. They developed a thermal generator that you basically put on the exhaust of your afterburner.
Oh,
so that all that heat that you're putting out from the afterburner is then getting recirculated, turned into energy and recirculated. I've heard of I think it was a company out of Portland. It was like kind of the first tester of that system.
That's like a turbo in a car. It just takes the exhaust gas and then it converts it back into usable energy.
Oh, that's stuff like neat. That. It's those little kinds of things that I really dig. I really get off on that.
Yeah, so that's that's kind of the stuff that is coming around the corner, and it's so cool that you're into that, because that's, you're going to take the new technology, incorporate it into your process, and I'm sure that's sort of like a new frontier of like, hey, what kind of quality can we maintain? Are there any new quality improvements that you can gain by the new technology? And at least from me as an outsider, definitely like the technology software side seems to be pretty big these days. I've heard that you can kind of upload all of your roasting data.
Oh yeah.
Are there like apps where
you see that cord that's it's probably hard to see, but once we're done you can take a peek at it. There's a cord there that I basically plug that in. I'm piggybacking off of this Probat's where the thermocouple wires go into the computer system. I'm piggybacking off of those, and then from there that can plug into my computer. And that different app that I use is called Cropster. Okay. That's probably the biggest from what I know. There's some other ones. There's actually one here. I'm pretty sure they're here in Fort Collins. Artisan, and that's more like home roasters really like that because it's absolutely free. If you're like a commercial roaster, you should probably be paying for it in good faith. But that one's a great one too, Artisan. If there's home roasters that are interested in that, but it's back in the day in Laramie, we were basically just using an Excel spreadsheet. So we'd data log different data points. Like what our low was at the beginning of the roast. We'd mark down the time and temperature, and then we'd hit 300 degrees, and we'd mark down what that time was. So very primitive, rudimentary way. And now basically it's a full-on in real time curve of your roast profiles. And I think I'm right there with you, man. That's going to be the future. And Cropster, for instance, they've just implemented some AI technology that will show you basically if you're at a minute 30 in your roast, it'll show you, I think, out 2 minutes past. So it'll show you where your projected roast is going to be in about 3 minutes.
So the obvious question is, are there going to be auto roasters, and is the technology going to be good enough to sort of, you load the coffee, hit go, and it produces that God roast?
Yeah, I've been talking about automation for a long time, how I think just things are moving towards that way in the coffee industry, and that's Cropster and doing that. That's one big piece of it. A lot of those, Starbucks at their main facility, they've got, the roaster that I was on a little bit in Indianapolis, that one that did 700 pounds, it's basically the same roaster that Starbucks has, but they've got 8 of them, and so all 8 of those are all fully integrated. I think how they do it, I think they have like 7 running nonstop, and then that 8th, they just filter in one they're doing maintenance on. So they have like one shutdown a day to do maintenance on, but all of those, I think it'd be pretty boring to be a roaster for them because you're basically, no one's standing next to the roasters. They're all, I think there's a team of guys that they're in a control room. Those roasters are automated.
Yeah, fully.
They don't have to touch anything. The door opens, your green coffee drops in automatically, it pulls it out automatically, and then it shoots it up a conveying system to the packing areas. But, there's still certainly, I can only imagine they have a giant team of people that are cupping those coffees.
Just to make sure.
So that's the big piece is once the technology, that's the one that's missing is the taste component. Because you can have everything that looks great on paper and it looks great on Cropster, and just for whatever reason, it just doesn't taste how you want it to, So being able to translate the automation with the taste component, that'll be the big one. Yeah.
So to me, it seems like there's enough. I mean, this is a plant product. So of course, even if you get the same variety from the same farm, it's going to be different every single time just by natural variation, right? So to me, it seems like, the real art and the real dance with roasting is, you as the master roaster, you kind of know where everything needs to be, but you can adapt to minute changes better than any software could. Perhaps
that's kind of where the art is at this point, the art of roasting. And once, an AI system is able to take that intuition that I have for, the different variables and inputs that go into the roast, then it might be able to replicate it. But yeah, at this point, there's just so many variables to get over. You've got what the processing method was, and then further down than that, what the varietal of the coffee was, the density, what the moisture content in the coffee is, just to name a few. And then once the bags are here in the roaster, your shop has to have a consistent ambient temperature, or else your green beans, before you even load them in, will fluctuate in temperature. And then, your inside temperature, your outside temperatures, those all play a role. How humid it is. We're fortunate, at least here in Fort Collins, that it's always pretty relatively dry. So I don't have to worry too much about that. And that's just a couple, and then how your stack, your exhaust stack, how that's set up, how often you clean it, because things roast a lot differently from when it's packed full of coffee oils and chaff. And then once you clean it, your airflow, if you don't compensate for that, so a lot of that just day to day, it's just, that's where what I'm feeling when I'm roasting, is I'm just analyzing all the different conditions and then going off of that temperature curve from Cropster, which is, enormously helpful, can help me in a lot of ways.
Correct me if I'm wrong, that the kind of the art of roasting and the reason why it's so tricky is that actually, first, how long does it take to roast a batch of, say, 17 pounds?
Yeah. So on a drum, there's a few different styles of roasters. You can use what's called a fluid bed roaster, and that essentially, it's like a popcorn popper. It's using hot air. So your convective energy is a lot higher. It might be 80, 90% convective heat transfer, as opposed to this drum roaster, which has a lot more conductive heat transfer, which is, when those beans are riding on the drum, they're literally making contact with that hot surface. And so that's your conductive heat. And then you've got your convective, it's a certain percentage. I think it's 60-40 on this Probat, but so with a fluid bed, you're looking at 7, convective heat is a lot more efficient. So those roasts go a lot quicker. So it can be anything from 7 to 13 in that range. On these drum roasters, and it's interesting because with that little sample roaster that does 100 grams versus this roaster versus that roaster in Indianapolis that does 700 pounds, it's pretty much, 10 to 15 minutes a batch.
Pretty consistent.
Yeah. You just have your smaller burner here, and then, on that big boy, that was essentially a jet engine sized flame, to heat all that. So
wow,
it's pretty consistent batch times.
Okay. So is the hard part that once you turn the heat off, those beans are still still cooking. It's kind of like when you take a
Yeah.
steak out of the oven or whatever, where it's still going to cook. So you almost want to take it out just before it's done.
Yeah.
That way, when it finally, that temperature
Absolutely.
goes down.
Because you're going to get a little bit of roast once you get into the cooling tray, it's going to continue to roast for a little bit, a minute or two. So yeah, you have to know when to pull it. Bigger machines, this one might have the capabilities for it, but on your bigger roasters, they have what's called a quench. So there's a line that literally runs through the drum, and to end the roast, you just hit quench and it just, boom, pours out. And on the big roaster I was on, I think it was like 5 gallons of water it would quench.
shit.
And it doesn't add any water weight to it. It's
Okay.
essentially, it just stops your roast.
Interesting. It just
And when
evaporates.
yeah,
cools
instantly.
down.
It just cools it, evaporates.
Huh.
But if you don't do that, you have hundreds of pounds that's still roasting as opposed to, 17 or so.
So, have you ever hit a perfect roast, or how often, I should say?
Man, I just with how many variables and different inputs you have going into a roast, that's for any commercial roaster, that's the challenge is consistency. Once you hit that roast that you like, being able to nail it time after time, that's where the difficulty lies. And that's where you kind of use your blend of technology and science with your intuition and kind of the art of it. But I have roasts all the time that I think are killer. And then, the next week it's still good, but it's not quite where it was.
Yeah.
And a lot of the, like what you were saying too, with taste is so subjective. And some days I'm like, I just don't even know if I'm like, that coffee might be exactly the same as last week. I might just be tasting it differently.
That's a good point too.
What did I eat beforehand?
Right.
When did I brush my teeth, in the morning?
Right.
That all plays a role too.
Do you have a favorite roast that stands out in your mind, like a dream almost? Like, 'cause I've talked to a couple of coffee shop roasters, and some of them say like, back in the 80s or 90s, I hit this one perfect roast and I've been chasing it ever since. And I always think that's
not
funny.
Really. I guess I'll say, I've got a coffee in right now from Peru, and it just roasts like a dream. And it's like you set your initial temperature at the beginning, and then it almost just roasts itself,
That's
and that's
cool.
kind of what I try and set up. I like the beginning of your roast, once you drop your coffee into the roaster, and then, it hits its low point, and then it's, at least in the environment temp, basically then I'm ramping up the heat from that point on. And so that low I kind of see that as like a launch pad, so if I can get that launch pad perfect and where I basically make minimal adjustments in the end, that means it's, it's set up right. And that's a good roast for me, but that Peru, especially, it's like all the beans, they're all very uniform in size. It's got a great density. It takes heat really well. So yeah, it just comes out of the roaster and it's like the most even beans. I'll show you after this. It's like,
Cool.
yeah, and that's where, you want, as a roaster, a lot of times you're paying for higher quality beans because they've been sorted a lot more. So you don't have smaller beans with bigger beans, because that's just going to throw everything off. If you have too much differentiation in size, it's really tricky to get an even batch size. You can tweak some things here and there, but so those are kind of my favorite coffees to roast, the ones that just take heat well. They just soak up that heat super even across the board with your batch, and minimal adjustments. They kind of just roast themselves. And I've had a couple Perus that's the case. And then the last one I remember, it was a coffee from Bali. Totally, probably some flavor profile you've never even had before. It was just like super rich, and same kind of region as Sumatra, but didn't have like a lot of that earthiness that you get with Sumatran coffees. And again, it was a bigger bean size, and it just almost roasted itself. It was great.
That's awesome. Well, Kyle, thanks for taking the time to.
Yeah, man, it was a pleasure, and it was great to see you.
Likewise, yeah.
A long time.
And I get a kick out of this stuff too, just hearing about the art of roasting, and it's kind of the part that I never really do as just a consumer of coffee. So it was a real treat. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your skill
Yeah,
and
of course.
the space. And So if people want to buy some coffee, just head to wandercoffee.com.
Wondercoffee.com. Yeah.
Anything else you want to kind of mention before we go?
No, that was it, man.
Cool.
It's good chatting with you.
All right.
Good to see you. And
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'll put up all the links and your Instagram and website and stuff like that. But yeah, I've been drinking Wander Coffee for years now, and I think it's always the go-to. And so for everybody else out there, I recommend it.
yeah, we thank you, man. It's because of everyone like you that we've been able to do what we love.
Cool.
For sure. So we appreciate you.
Awesome.
Thanks, Alex.
All right. Peace.